Asyle, the Engineer, and the Island. Week 25, Day 1. It has now been 6 months, officially half a year, since I became stranded on this island. In light of my recent accomplishments, I feel inclined to celebrate the occasion. Nevertheless, I have a routine to uphold, so first I'll put my clay record plates in the kiln and proceed with my standard morning chores. Next, I conducted my maintenance survey, though I found I was in a bit of a hurry because I wanted to get back to my latest project. I skimmed through the beach hut, which has been all but abandoned since I moved into the house, and I didn't really bother checking on the catamaran. None of the hen houses had fallen over or anything, and the yam and taro gardens were ready for harvest around week 19, but I was so busy with defenses that I never bothered to harvest them. This week may be a good time to do that, but they'll keep for now. The kitchen hut seemed alright, and there didn't seem to be any breaks yet in the refrigeration system, so all I did was replace the salt and clean up the dust that naturally fell to the floor. The door lock needed a little grease, but that was about it. I went to the workshop and removed the batteries from the charger, having forgot about it yesterday, and reset the electrolysis rig, another setback for the dynamo, but I made a note that the next plate should be ready on day 4 this week. On that note, the lathe has been doing a lot of work the last couple of weeks, and I was worried that the bearings would start failing, so I slowed down to trim and install a few replacements. The drill press had seen some action as well, but I wouldn't say too much. I still had a couple of spare drill heads left. The ore crusher had also seen a lot of action, and the hammer guide was definitely fraying around the edges. The stones themselves, however, still seemed to be intact. I don't think I've used the auto loom at all this month. I checked on the bathhouse, and I'd hardly used the pool either, so there wasn't a lot to clean up there. Again, just the shower and toilet. No signs of leakage so far. It was the lab that had seen the most action the last couple of weeks. The Van de Graaff generator seemed to be alright, just needed a little grease on the rollers. The nitric acid bubbler, however, had been putting in work, and in spite of my best efforts to minimize exposure, the nitric acid vapors had seriously eaten away at the rubber in the hose and pump. The only way I could think of to fix this was to situate the pump at the top of the fractionating column, so it only had to be exposed to the less acidic vapors that made it to the top of the column, and to connect the zapper to the bubbler without a hose. I quickly concluded that this would require a machine dedicated to that function, so I put it on my to-do list. For the moment, though, I had more nitric acid stockpiled than was probably safe for any person to have, so I just turned the bubbler off and prepared a simple latex hose and membrane to replace the ones that got eaten by acid. I didn't consider the explosives mixer quite finished yet, without a clock to run it completely automatically, but I don't need more explosives for the time being, and I'm not going to stockpile them, for obvious reasons. Frankly, I'm starting to run out of storage space for a lot of the chemicals I've been collecting. Next was the solar tower, and I could tell that the pumps up my path were starting to leak. Not the pipes, but the pumps themselves seemed to be getting worn out, especially within the tower itself, where they had to deal with higher pressures. I turned the tower off for the time being, and let the water drain out of the pipes, so I could apply a little latex to the parts that were leaking, and give them a chance to seal and dry. The pulleys in the elevator needed a little grease too. The kiln itself seemed to be doing alright, in spite of the heat stresses I've been putting it under. There were some breaks in the pressure cooker seals, but those were easy to fix too. The reflector panels needed the slack pulled out of them, but that was about it. Fortunately for me, they didn't really need to be cleaned because the dazzling light seemed to scare the birds away from it, and the radiant heat, while intense, was not so intense that it burned them to a crisp in midair like real concentrated solar power stations. That just left the house, and it was new enough that there wasn't really anything in it that needed maintenance, so I was finally free to get back to work on my recording projects. I was just in time for one of the Bible readings too, so I tried to catch up in writing the text down. I considered this the next bottleneck to my recording scheme, so when I was done, I started making some plans for a typewriter. I was familiar enough with the basic mechanics of a typewriter. You press a key, which presses a lever, which flings an inked letter into the page. However, my impression with typewriters is that pressing those buttons must have taken a lot of force. What's more, while these mechanisms bear a close resemblance to those I built for the music machine, I don't think I can make them small and delicate enough to fit within the space of my two hands, nor do I want to waste precious metal on something like that. Besides, all of those levers seem to me to overcomplicate what should otherwise be a simple process. Press key, letter on page. Why not cut out the middleman? Of course, I know why. The tricky part is getting every letter to hit exactly the same spot on the page without the mechanisms having to be all in the same place. I've kind of got an idea for how to fix that though, which will result in a pretty weird looking typewriter. Instead of organizing the keys on a plane, I can organize them along an arc. That way, when I press on them, any given key will converge to the same point, and if they're a little off, I can add a funnel at the end to help keep them on the track. The next major mechanism will be the one that scrolls the page as I type, and this one should actually be kind of easy. If I put a sort of ratchet bar on the scroll, basically a bunch of inclined planes, and a peg or rod on each key to touch them, then every time I press a key, it'll move the scroll a little to the left so I can type the next letter. Next, to make it go down a line when I reach the edge of the page, I can attach the scroll itself to a ratchet wheel. I can wind up the scroll with a rubber band and wrap a piece of paper around it, and set up the ratchet wheel such that when the scroll is pushed all the way to the left, the catch on the ratchet releases and pushes the paper up one increment. I can kind of do the same thing for the ratchet bar too, attaching it to the frame with a rubber band that gets stretched a little with each keystroke, and putting a catch on it that releases once it reaches the end of the line, and brings the whole scroll back to the starting position. I really only had time to collect the bamboo I needed for the typewriter before the clock chimed for lunch. Then I got to it, starting with the frame, being careful to position the reticule at the exact center of the arc for the keys, which I had to drill a lot of holes into to house them. I mounted the reticule above one support rod, rather than taking the easier path of just drilling a hole in a piece of bamboo for it, so that I can actually see the words I'm typing as I type them. I had to stop before moving on though, because my alarm went off for the record plates, which I removed from the kiln and cooled. I kind of needed to finish this before the typewriter, so I can get the sermons recorded and batch write them later. The tricky part at this point was finding some material to cover the records in, which would hold an audio recording. This proved a more difficult task than I expected. Some of the earliest phonographs used wax for their recordings, but not only are there no bees on this island, tragically, it's so hot here that wax would probably melt too quickly to hold any sort of recording anyway. The closest thing I had to wax was soap, which I gave a try, heating and pouring it into a thin glaze on one of the discs, but I only succeeded in creating a mess, because it was also too soft to hold a recording from the gramophone. I racked my brain a little more to try and come up with something. Edison's original phonograph used tin foil, but even if I wanted to waste metal on this, I didn't have tin or aluminum. The lead's too soft, copper's probably too hard, and I didn't think I could make a foil that thin and smooth with the tools I had available to me anyway. Besides, if I remember correctly, those phonograph cylinders tended to tear easily. Later gramophone records used vinyl, or more specifically polyvinyl chloride, to store recordings. That's a plastic though, and I didn't even know where to begin in synthesizing it. I asked myself if there were any other materials I had access to which had similar properties, hard enough to hold a shape, but soft enough to be scratched. As I rummaged around through my chemical and mineral specimens, I had a light bulb moment and realized that all the leftover rosin I had for making varnish would be perfect. The amber-like material is hard, scratchable, and doesn't melt nearly as easily as wax or soap, so I gave it a try. I heated up the rosin in the kiln until it melted, using just a little bit of turpentine to help it liquefy again, before pouring a thin coat onto my spinning discs to make the most of the material, as opposed to simply casting the records out of solid rosin. While it was still soft, but no longer runny, I used the lathe to carefully cut a spiral groove for the gramophone stylus, being careful to make the groove at an even speed so the grooves wouldn't waste space or overlap and cause the recording to repeat endlessly. I made several, and the good news is, if I make a mistake, they'll be easy to reheat and reshape. I guess this gives new meaning to the phrase, to cut a record. Once the records were finished and cooled, I gave one a try on the gramophone. Like Edison, I didn't really expect it to work correctly on the first try, so like Edison, I was also surprised when it worked, and I heard my own voice spoken back to me like some kind of magic trick. Instead of the time-honored tradition of reciting Mary Had a Little Lamb, I chose to recite a scripture verse, and the only one that sprung to my mind was, "Faith is the foundation of hope, and the evidence of the intangible." Again, the surprise of the device's effectiveness made me laugh out loud, but I continued testing the record and made a few observations. Firstly, the gramophone would overwrite the record while it was being played with any other sounds in the room, such as my outburst of laughter, though this was somewhat to be expected. Fortunately, my office is pretty insulated and quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The other was that the recording got steadily quieter and more muffled the more times it was used. This was probably due to the fishbone stylus cutting into the recording a little each time it was replayed. I found I could fix both of these problems by dulling the fishbone stylus a little so that it would wiggle with the recording but not cut it as badly. However, this also meant I could no longer use it for recording. But this I was able to easily fix by building a second stylus onto the crystal oscillator of the gramophone, this time out of a much harder piece of copper wire, which resulted in a much stronger and louder recording. Conveniently, the writing stylus stuck up on the opposite end of the gramophone head from the reading stylus, so all I had to do to switch functions was rotate the stylus. I fixed the overwriting issues just in time to test the gramophone with the Bible reading over the radio, which I wrote down manually anyway, just to make sure I didn't miss it. The recording was just about perfect. With that out of the way, I got back to my typewriter, beginning construction of the 26 letter keys, 10 number keys, and 4 major punctuation keys. I can add more later if I need to. These basically consisted of several thin bamboo rods with a rubber band connecting them to the frame, to which I attached smooth trimmed caps on the ends, with letters carved into them for identification. The opposite ends of the rods, however, were open, and my plan was to fill them with ink and let it leak out slowly through fibers in the cap on the end, kind of like a felt pen. Charcoal, like that in my pencil, wouldn't soak into the paper's surface with a quick impression. It took some very slow and meticulous work to carve out a tiny stencil for each letter perfectly, and I decided not to bother with lowercase letters. I wasn't able to finish them all before the end of the day. Week 25, Day 2. I got up, did my morning chores, and finished carving out the keys for my typewriter, filling in the letters with a bit of cellulose thread to function as a wick for the ink, in addition to putting a little paper over the insides to keep ink from leaking out at any great rate if something went wrong. I was about to attach the letter caps to the key rods when I realized a problem. Because of the arched configuration of the keys, they weren't going to stamp flat onto the paper. This could have been solved simply if I could have just beveled the ends of the keys, but the letter caps kind of made that impossible, nor would they slide on correctly if I tried to bevel them. I needed to either curve or joint the ends of the keys so that they would hit the paper flat, or put the letter caps on some kind of pivot so they could flex to hit the page flat. Initially, I thought the jointed ends would be best, because less movement means less chances for anything to break. However, that would have taken up a lot of space in an already cramped mechanism, potentially keeping the keys from fitting together properly. Plus, the pivots would be easier to manufacture and repair once built, if I sealed them on with a liberal amount of latex to make them flexible. That was the plan I ended up going with, so I took my key rods and trimmed down the ends until they were round, and allowed the caps to jiggle around a little on the ends. Then I coated them with successive layers of latex until I could fit the cap on snugly and seal them on more or less permanently. With that little problem out of the way, I could get on to building the scroll. I took a larger diameter piece of bamboo and hollowed it out, trimming out a slot on one side for the paper to slide through. I partially split a smaller piece of bamboo to act as the axle, the split making a convenient clamp to hold onto the paper, as well as to attach the rubber band for winding the mechanism. Next, I trimmed some grooves into another piece of bamboo for the ratchet bar, as well as the scroll itself, and used a couple of thin sticks and cord for a torsion spring to make the ratchet mechanisms, before mounting the scroll assembly onto some bamboo rods that would let it slide easily back and forth without a lot of flexing. While I was working on this, the Bible reading started, and I made sure that the gramophone started recording on time. When it was over, I also made sure that the clock in the gramophone was wound and calibrated, and that the timer was set to catch the next transmission, just in case there was a problem with the first recording. I then had a quick lunch before having to deal with the next problem with my typewriter, which was getting the keys to push on the ratchet bar properly. Again, the arched arrangement of the keys was causing problems, because they couldn't hit the ratchet bar at the same angle. I guess this is why real typewriters aren't built this way. Still, I came up with a fix by basically putting a big button below the targeting reticule that would push on the ratchet bar head on, and would be pushed by the keys when they came in to press a letter onto the page. This mechanism was also tied directly into the space bar. Finally, I added a few little pegs to the scroll's ratcheting mechanism, which caused it to completely open and retract when it reached the far left side of the page, and then reset the ratchet to its original position upon returning to the far right. I was soon tic-tacking away, confirming all the buttons and mechanisms worked as intended. Unlike a normal typewriter, it didn't make that loud, sharp, tacking sound when I hit the keys, but rather a soft, hollow tapping and clicking of the wooden parts, which I frankly preferred to the obnoxious sound of a traditional typewriter. However, there was still one thing I was missing, and now I feel like I kind of put the cart before the horse, because I have a typewriter, but no ink to put in it. I could probably use just about any dye that isn't based on some kind of suspended particles, which would be filtered out by the felt pads on my pens. This again probably means that I can't use charcoal or carbon. Maybe indigo would work, but my transplants haven't finished growing in yet by a long shot, and it feels like I should conserve them for other projects. There is one ink I'm familiar with from Rough Science, where they use iron sulfate, which is more or less the same stuff my iron ore is made of, but I'm not sure if the minerals would be filtered out by the felt. Squid ink might be another option if I could get a hold of some, but they don't tend to get caught on my trot lines, probably too smart and too slippery to get caught on the hooks. However, I think it's probably my best bet. Unfortunately though, squid only come out at night, so I would have to wait until then to catch any. Even if I made some squid jigs to catch them with, they would probably squirt most of their ink into the water before I could catch any of it. I could just cut the ink sacs out of them and get the ink in a more concentrated form, but 1, it would take a lot of them. 2, I don't eat calamari, and 3, I don't want to kill them just for their ink. Finally, I would have to go out on my boat again, and I still don't think I'm ready for that, especially not at night, even in the kayak. If I could lure an octopus into a jar or something, and then scare the ink out of it, that would probably be easier. The trouble with catching an octopus is, firstly, they're active predators, so I can't just put a wad of fish guts in a pot and expect them to come eat it. I'd need live bait. And secondly, they're master escape artists, able to fit into any space the size of their beak, which can be quite small depending on the octopus species. Even if I gave the trap some kind of one-way valve, their suckers and tentacles would make it easy for them to pull the valves back open, and they're smart enough to solve complex puzzles, so any trap I make probably isn't going to hold them for long. However, being ectothermic, once they've eaten, they won't need to hunt for a while, and a pot would make a safe hiding place until they needed to go out again, which would give me a good window of opportunity to catch them in, since it would also take a while for them to get back out again. It's probably not the best plan. It's going to take forever to get enough ink to do anything with, but it is a renewable resource, and it would give me a chance to study the octopus species living around the reef, so I think I'll give it a try. I prepared some clay and made a few pots with lids that I could seal on by rotating them. On top of the lids, I left a little hole in the handle just small enough that crabs and small fish couldn't get in, but an octopus would have no problem. I made a whole bunch of these pots and made some bamboo floats to help me find them again later, like crab pots. However, I'm kicking myself now for not starting this earlier, because now they won't be ready to go into the water until tomorrow afternoon. But that's what I deserve for not planning ahead and getting tunnel vision on the typewriter project. While I was making things out of clay, I decided I really needed to finish the mosaic work I started on the solar tower. I have loads of olivine powder from my ore separating apparatus, but at this point, I wasn't sure if it was worth the effort to tile the whole thing, instead of just applying a layer of lime spackle and being done with it. My sense of long-term planning, combined with the sunk cost fallacy, got the better of me though, as the tiles would provide additional waterproofing to the tower that would protect it from the weather. I didn't have anything better to do today anyway, so I spent the rest of it making tiles and grinding olivine down into a fine powder to spread on them. Then I got ready for bed. Week 25, Day 3. I put my pots in the solar kiln in the morning, and my tiles in the kitchen kiln to keep things rolling along. I don't think I'll be able to get all the tiles done today. There was no point in wasting the wood and heat though, and as I mentioned, my crops were long overdue for a harvest, so I decided I wanted to spend some time today exploring the culinary arts. I'm normally the kind of person who's just fine eating the exact same thing every single day, but even for me, salted fish and baked breadfruit gets old after literally half a year. I'm usually just so busy making other things that I just grab what I already have prepared or is quickest to make for my meals. So I spent most of the morning harvesting my yams and taros. It's been about 5 months since I initially planted them, and under the tropical sun, with plenty of fresh water, I was certainly starting to see appreciable fruit, or roots as it were. The taros were almost done, their broad, dark green leaves completely shading their terrace pond. I pulled up the biggest ones, leaving the smaller ones to continue growing, cutting off part of the corms as I went to replant them. The yams, on the other hand, were finished around week 19, but I was too busy fearing for my life to really pay much attention, and they've since already started their second round of growth, which will probably allow them to grow more robustly. I still harvested the largest tubers, and my system for growing and watering them semi-aeroponically has really paid off because they're as easy to harvest as picking tomatoes off a vine. One good thing about growing food in the tropics is that conditions are pretty consistent all year round, so by planting and harvesting different terraces at different parts of the year, I should be able to stagger their relative growth rates and have fresh vegetables all year long, which is probably needed given the diet I've been living on so far. This also means I don't really need to store my food. I can just leave it in the ground until I need it, but for today, I at least wanted to experiment with my cooking and storage options. Next, I prepared some of the taro and yams that I'd collected. I needed to peel the skin off of them, and I didn't want to risk cutting myself, but fortunately, the peeler I built for stripping cord from bamboo worked perfectly for this job. While I was at it, I got the idea that I could use the peeler to make thin sections of the tubers themselves, which I could turn into potato chips and/or taro chips. I melted some coconut oil in a pot and dipped the chips in, but instead of trying to deep fry them, which would probably have ended in a fire using coconut oil, I just coated the chips and left them in a different pot to bake. Probably healthier that way anyway. I knew the taro contained toxins when raw, but they could be removed by cooking or boiling the corms, so I put them in a pot of water in the kitchen kiln, above the tiles being baked, in order to make the most of the heat. The leaves were also edible and probably rich in vitamins, which I was probably getting deficient on after half a year of fish and fruit. I couldn't exactly keep them around for salads later, though, not that I really like salads anyway, so I laid them out on the roof of my house to dry them out, so I could mix them in with my meals later as an herb, kind of like we used to use with frozen spinach back home. The yams also had toxins, indicated by the bitter flavor of the immature tubers, though less so with the larger ones, but they were also eliminated by cooking. Some I added to the taro pot, and a few I cooked on skewers over the fire like baked potatoes for lunch. A little sea salt complemented the sweetness of the tuber, and it's not like salt has been in a short supply thanks to the solar tower. What yams I didn't prepare for my celebratory feast this evening, I preserved. Both taros and yams are roots that stay alive after being picked and consume their nutrients while inactive. This generally means that they keep themselves preserved, especially in cool, dry environments like the cellar. But my concern was that they would be losing nutrient value in that state, another reason to pick them mostly as needed. It's not like they would keep for longer than 7 months, so I could probably have a surplus anyway. Once I was done with lunch, I pulled the chips out of the kiln and gave them a try. The taros in particular had a sweet, nutty flavor that was perfected with a little salt, so I'll remember to make more for snacking in the future. I also pulled out the boiled potatoes in taro, and yes, they were fine by themselves, but a bit bland. I had an idea, though, to try to make potato bread from them. At first, I thought I would need to dry them into flour, but then I figured that didn't really make any sense, because I'd be adding water back into them anyway, so I just mashed them. The problem I foresaw with this, though, was that without flour, it wouldn't have any gluten to give it structure. So instead, I got some eggs and whipped the whites, like I'd seen on the Great British Baking Show. Consequently, this ended up making something more like a cake sponge than a bread, not that I was going to complain about cake. I crushed and boiled some of the sugar cane that had been growing behind the kitchen hut, and chopped up some of the vanilla grass to give it a sweeter flavor, as well as a little coconut oil to help enhance the flavor, and to keep it from sticking to the pot I decided to cook the cake in. I still kind of wanted bread, though, but I obviously couldn't use eggs for it because they would go bad and give me salmonella if I left the batter out to catch yeast and start proofing like a sourdough bread. I set some aside just to give it a try, but without gluten, the best I could make right away was sort of like a flatbread or pancake. I didn't completely mind it though, because it reminded me of Passover. That made me think that, on the plus side, with the foods I had available to me here, I would never have to worry about removing the leaven, because I couldn't really cook with it anyway. By this time, the tiles and octopus pots had finished cooking, so I removed them and let them cool. While I waited on that, I searched the beach and under rocks for crabs to put in the octopus pots, before taking them out in the kayak to likely places before it could get dark. I kind of felt bad for the crabs, but someone had to be prey for the octopi. If it wasn't them, it would have been someone else, though I'm sure the crabs don't appreciate that line of reasoning, even if it's accurate. I certainly don't. I still had a couple of hours to kill when I was done. I left the sugarcane juice to reduce over the course of the day, and by that time it had reduced down to brownish crystals from molasses still in the sugar. Still tasted pretty good to me, if slightly bitter, and I figured it would make a good icing of a sort for my cake. Alternatively, heating it up again may have allowed me to turn it into a caramel. I considered that I could have separated the pure sugar from the molasses with a centrifuge, or maybe by crystallizing it like my Rochelle salt crystals on a string, like rock candy. I decided to try that last one, and started another round of sugarcane boiling before the sun went down, and I left it to crystallize overnight. After that, I got ready for bed, and had my cake with my dinner. It wasn't the greatest cake in the world, but for what I've been eating up till now, it was amazing, and an excellent treat to commemorate my 0.5th year on the island. Week 25, Day 4. When I got up in the morning to do my chores, while I was checking on the trot lines, I also got out in the kayak and checked on my octopus pots, figuring the octopi were most likely to have been hunting during the night, like most predators. Most of them were empty, but I did find one with an octopus in it. My guess was that it was a common octopus, since they basically live everywhere in the ocean, but I was surprised by how big it was. For some reason, I was also expecting it to try and get away the instant I retrieved the pot, but it was just sitting there at the bottom, probably trying to camouflage itself, which I guess makes sense as its default strategy. This at least allowed me to get a good look at it and save a mental picture for putting in my sketchbooks later. Next, I had to think of a way to get the ink out of it, and at first, I figured I would just poke it with a stick or shake the pot to scare it into releasing ink, but I didn't really want to hurt it or scare it any more than I needed to, so instead, I put on my gloves and just tried to pick it up. I was kind of scared too. Like I said, it was kind of a big animal, almost a foot across when wadded up into a ball. However, this alone was enough to scare it into filling the pot with ink before slipping out of my hands and back into the water. I was quite pleased with that interaction overall. The bigger octopus made me more ink than I was expecting to get, so I may not need to collect as many of them as I thought I would. I took the pot back with me and poured out the ink water into a different bowl, leaving behind bits of crab in the bottom of the pot from the octopus's dinner. I left it to reduce in the solar kiln while I did my foraging in the morning, and when I came back, the ink had concentrated a fair amount. It smelled pretty fishy, though. I tried a little bit of it on a piece of scrap paper, and while it left a discoloration, it wasn't really dark enough for writing. Maybe needs another hour or two. In the meantime, I wanted to continue exploring my culinary options. My sugar crystals hadn't crystallized yet. I guess they weren't as eager to do that as Rochelle salt. Still, I had some sweet, brownish sugar water, and it reminded me of one more thing I've really missed from the mainland: Coca-Cola. When I first arrived on the island, I got bad headaches from caffeine withdrawals, but they went away after a few days. Now, I think I might be able to get something of my favorite drink back. I spent some time mixing in different flavors from different plants on the island to try to create my own soda flavors, though my options were limited, as there was certainly no way I was going to be able to recreate the flavor of Coke here. I did, however, manage to make something that tasted kind of like a flat cream soda, using the vanilla grass for flavor, a green cream, if you will. I thought it would be nice if I could get some carbonation into it, and fortunately for me, I've made root beer at home before. Normally, you add a packet of wine yeast to it, but all I could really do here was leave it exposed to the air so it could catch some random yeasts floating in the air. Once it had been sitting out for a while, I put it in that glass bottle I accidentally made a while back and sealed it up. The carbon dioxide from fermentation should cause it to fill with bubbles, just like a soda, so long as I can keep the bottle pressurized. This will also produce a little bit of alcohol, like wine, but not enough to really be noticeable. I looked around for other things I could experiment with in the kitchen. Obviously, the coconuts have many uses, but up till now, I've been using the coconuts as their own storage vessel, since I didn't want to harvest the food out of them, only for it to go bad later. I've been drinking the milk whenever straight water gets boring, but I've never really liked the flavor too much. Pina coladas have never really been my thing. I especially dislike the texture of the meat, though I've been scraping and squeezing it to get out the oil and remaining milk. Even so, I knew better than to let it go to waste, so every now and then I've been mixing it with my breadfruit paste to make something almost like a carrot cake, another thing I never really liked too much. The breadfruit at least could be stored for long periods of time and fermented into a starchy mash, which I mixed the coconut into. I could probably try to make this into a cake too, but I still haven't finished the first one. Bananas have been another good source of food, but they go soft pretty quickly, so I've been cutting up the old ones into chips and drying them in the sun to preserve them as a sweet snack, though it tends to get stuck in my molars, another important reason to brush. The trick, though, has been getting them to dry without exposing them to flies or cooking them in the kiln, so I've been putting them in my old solar dehydrating oven from the Catamaran project, and I put a cloth over the top of them to keep the bugs out. The leaves have also proven useful to me over the months as well, as they are large and contiguous, so they've made great waterproof coverings, shingles, cooking surfaces, placemats, and even disposable plates. And while I've heard that the flowers can technically be eaten, having a flavor and structure resembling artichoke, I've been leaving them alone so they can turn into fruit. The numerous strangler figs growing up trees all around the island have also produced an abundance of food for me, though most of the time they've been up so high that I haven't been able to reach them, and I've had to just pick the ones off the ground that didn't look too rotten. The worst ones I save for the ethanol pot. Incidentally, I found that the fig trees also produce latex, so I'm in no short supply there. I've been drying these too, but it also occurred to me that I could mash them and dehydrate them in jars to make jam. I spent some time this morning working on that, putting a seal of latex around the lids of the jars when I was done, and putting them in the pressure cooker at the top of the solar tower to cook. The high pressure and temperature will kill any bacteria in the fig jam, and when they cool, the condensing water vapor in the jam jars will create a vacuum that seals them shut. This is another one of the few things I'm doing here that I've actually done before. Reminded me of when I used to pick wild blackberries with Dad and Nat back home, and turn them into jam. Hit me with another wave of nostalgia and homesickness. Around this time, I stopped for a quick lunch, which basically amounted to letting myself eat cake, as it were, before checking again on the octopus ink. It had reduced down enough that I believed it would work more effectively as ink. As a bonus, the octopus naturally adds some mucus to the ink to thicken it and aid its escape from predators, which meant I didn't need to add a thickener to the ink or anything to help it stick to the page. In fact, I found the ink was a little too thick at this point, because when I poured it into my typewriter keys, it didn't really come out the end very well. I remembered that felt pens back home always had this horrible smell about them, indicating the presence of some kind of aromatic hydrocarbons. So I added a little ethanol to the ink to help it thin out a little. This worked, and a bonus effect of the ethanol was that it evaporates easily, which meant it would leave behind the dried ink on the page for less liquid ink overall. I didn't have quite enough yet, though, to fill up all the keys on my keyboard, so I got back to my cooking. Again, I needed more veggies in my diet, and I heard that bamboo shoots are edible. But at the same time, lately they've been more important to me for wood and replanting. However, it's not like they aren't popping up all the time, so I cut one and boiled it. It was crunchy and earthy, a little like water chestnuts, but I think they'll add an important source of minerals to my future meals. On the topic of chestnuts, I've occasionally picked up some Polynesian chestnuts from the forest floor, but they don't last long and have to be eaten right away, otherwise they go bad. They're also very bitter and probably toxic when uncooked, so I've had to indulge in them sparingly. I roasted and ground a few down, concluding they might make a nice garnish on top of fish or fruit. At this point, I couldn't think of much else to do, so I stopped putting it off and worked on tiling the solar tower some more. It was kind of the worst time of day to do it, so I tried to stick to the shadowed side of the solar tower. I got about 2/3 of the tower tiled by the late afternoon, and spent the last hour of daylight making the next round of tiles, before taking some time to relax and watch the sunset by the beach. However, I couldn't really enjoy it because of the thoughts that crossed my mind. All this cooking keeps reminding me of home, and I find myself wishing that Mom and Dad could enjoy this place with me. Mom especially loved this place with all the sunshine. But then I also find myself thinking somberly about how I would probably get tired of their company eventually, as they might start asking me to do things for them, or make changes to the base for them, probably aesthetic changes I wouldn't normally do for myself, and I would start longing for my own company again. I find myself feeling ashamed of this thought, and sad that I even have it, but I do. I know this tells me something about myself, but at the same time, it's not really something I want to acknowledge. For now, it simply reminds me that I'm duty-bound to leave eventually. Week 25, Day 5. I set my next batch of tiles cooking while I was out doing my morning chores. I checked my octopus pots again, and this time managed to catch a few more, so I once again gently scared the ink out of them before setting it in the kiln to reduce while I foraged. I could see that some of the octopus pots were empty of bait, suggesting that a few had already gotten in and out in the night. I at least brought some crabs with me this time to refill the pots and put them back once I'd removed the ink water. However, just in case the octopi were learning how to get a free meal without giving me any ink, I decided to just leave the empty ones that they'd snuck out of, just in case. When I went back to base and finished preserving the food I'd collected, I turned to my soda solution, which had been sitting out all night and had surely collected some yeast by this point. I poured it into my bottle and used an appropriately sized piece of bamboo for a cork, sealing it on with latex. If this turns out well, I may want to make more bottles for more soda, and just make it part of my routine. However, I need to do some more glass work, and the kiln is busy right now, so I need to think of something else to do today. I thought it would be nice if I could do something to continue expanding my food supply, or at least make foraging a little easier. I've been collecting and storing the seeds of the various plants I've been eating on the island. As I mentioned, I kept things like coconuts and tubers in storage, but there was a dual purpose to that, not only to keep them fresh, but also for planting if they started to go to seed. Other plants I've been eating regularly, like the bananas, figs, green grapefruits, and breadfruit, were not so easy to propagate. They had seeds, but although I've been saving them, they didn't seem to have a high chance of germination, though maybe I've been planting them wrong. A few did sprout, though, and I was interested in experimenting with selectively breeding them, assuming I had the time, but I also had the cuttings of the saplings that I collected from several tree specimens back when I started the garden, which have since either died off or managed to take root in the small pots or dirt piles I transplanted them into. At least the benefit of cuttings over seeds is that I'll be guaranteed that their fruit will be of the same quality as the parent plant. There was a little bit of clearing left on the opposite side of the rivulet from the workshop, which I normally didn't think about because, by this time, the bamboo fence had grown in to the point that I couldn't see it anymore. Out of sight, out of mind. Still, it seemed like the best place available to me to plant an orchard, so before it got too hot, I pulled out my hoe and digging stick and made some holes in nice rows down the hill. My plan was to have the shorter plants near the top of the hill and to the north, in rows going east to west, to take advantage of the sunlight, while putting the taller plants at the bottom/southernmost side of the hill so they wouldn't cast too much shade on the short plants. Once it started getting a bit hot out, I started planting the saplings I had, in addition to cutting a few new ones from the forest to fill out the rows, mostly bananas and breadfruit. I didn't really want the figs near my base because, 1, I don't really like them that much to begin with, and 2, they may eventually grow over and choke out all the other plants, or even destroy my architecture, like the temples of Angkor Wat. I won't be around to see that, obviously, but I kind of like the idea of the stuff I've built becoming the subject of archaeological study someday. Even so, I collected a handful of fig cuttings to plant in pots, not for food, but because I've often been interested in the art of bonsai, and the strangler figs grow relatively fast, so they'll be easier for me to work with. I didn't put the cuttings in the ground just yet, rather I also put them in pots, with dirt and a little compost from my compost bin, so I can keep an eye on them and plant them once the shock of being cut up has worn off, and they get their strength back. I thought to myself that it would be nice if I could come up with a way to make the plants grow faster, and I considered trying to put them in an atmosphere with higher carbon dioxide levels, possibly at elevated pressures. It wouldn't be too hard to do, at least while the plants were small. A little carbonate and vinegar would do the trick. However, I remembered looking into this sort of thing back home, and research conducted by actual scientists suggested that while the need for carbon was a factor limiting plant growth rates, high CO2 levels didn't actually help plants grow significantly faster, which at least saved me from constructing a complicated experiment inevitably doomed to failure. That's what science is for, I suppose. I'll just have to wait, but that's assuming I don't get picked up in the next week or so. By this time, my ink had mostly boiled down, so I completed the mix and poured it into my typewriter. It wasn't full, but I decided that it was enough to at least get started typing, which will also make my journaling process easier. Over lunch, I listened to the radio reading and checked on my recordings, which seemed to have gone well for the most part, though I found I'd lost some data where the record skipped. I need to do a better job of making a contiguous spiral groove next time. The typewriter allowed me to make short work of the transcription process, and while I was working on it, I got the idea of wrapping a thin piece of bamboo cord around a shaft to make the spiral groove for the records, provided I could keep that spiral on a plane. I took 2 of my blank records and gave it a try on the lathe, sandwiching the spiral between them. This did make a thin, contiguous spiral, but it wouldn't be easy to put onto the other records that way. However, by effectively grouting the spiral onto one of the records, I can use that record as a stamp to impress that spiral into future records. While I was in the workshop, I remembered the electrolysis rig, and that I forgot to remove the iron plate from it yesterday. I did so and wired it into the dynamo. One extra day of electrolysis didn't seem to hurt it, but I need to stop making these kinds of mistakes. I'm 3 plates in now, and my estimations of deposition rates increasing with each plate added to the dynamos seems to be holding so far, so the next plate should take about 3 more days, or day 1 next week. That should be easier to remember. By this time, the tiles in the kiln were finished, so I took them out to cool and spent a couple of hours finally finishing the tiling on the solar tower. There was no getting away from the sun this time, so I basically draped a wet towel across my back to keep the sun off, and at least keep me a little cool while I worked, going up and down the ladder. In a couple of hours the job was finished, and although it was a lot of work, I'm pleased with it. It doesn't totally blend in with the forest like I thought it might, but instead has a strange glitteriness from the olivine that'll probably help it catch the attention of anyone passing by who might see it, though now I'm not completely sure whether or not that's a good thing. If nothing else, it certainly looks less industrial, which I guess is what I was aiming for. I had some time to kill at the end of the day, so I decided to make some new records using my stamp method and leave them out to dry overnight. And while I was in the mud, I made some more pots to replace the ones that were used for planting today. Week 25, Day 6. I was woken up early this morning by something that caused my blood to freeze. The sound of voices. At first, I thought it was a dream, still half asleep, but as I regained consciousness, I realized it was coming from the listening trumpet below me. I stumbled out of bed and down into the panic room and raised the periscope to proper viewing position. It was dark, and I was having a hard time making things out through the already tinted lenses, but I could see a handful of men milling around the entrance of the bunker, standing around a dolly loaded with large black plastic cases. I could hear them speaking in a language I didn't understand. One of them was on a smartphone, and due to the fisheye nature of the lens, I could sort of see one person appearing to examine my transmitter. The guy with the phone then said something to the fellow by the antenna, who started doing something to the transmitter. I couldn't tell quite what, but his movements were fast enough and there were enough noises from the hearing trumpet that I could guess that he was probably destroying it. For a moment I held out a conflicted glimmer of hope that they might have been willing to take me home, but that glimmer has been completely snuffed out. They've revealed their hostile intentions. I thought I could see a pistol at one of their sides, so I quickly ran out to the courtyard and locked down all of my buildings before running back to the panic room. They had apparently gotten back to work loading their cases into the bunker from presumably a boat that I couldn't see through the periscope. Eventually, they disappeared from view. I waited for a maddening amount of time, what felt like days of suspense, before I heard the buzz of a motor outside. I saw a small motorboat round the corner of the island before landing on the beach. I made sure to rotate the periscope very slowly, so as not to attract their attention while I watched them. At first, they just seemed bewildered with the constructions they were viewing. One of them even wound up the music machine and seemed to laugh at the ingenuity. Even though I was terrified, I was also just a little bit proud and pleased that someone else appreciated it. I could see one had a hand close to his gun, while another started calling out in a language I couldn't understand. I knew they were calling for me, and each call shot through my spine and down my arms like lightning. My gnawing isolation, my need to obey, the chance, just the chance that they might show me mercy and take me home again, compelling me like a jerking rope around my throat to go up there. While my fear, now knowing that they meant to kill me, kept me rooted in the dark. I felt like I was being torn in half. I started to sob a little, out of the feeling of what little trust I had in humanity being betrayed. Again. Though I violently stifled each one through sheer force of willpower and by wadding my clothes in front of my face. The calls seemed to become more frequent and exasperated until they turned around and left. I collapsed on the floor, breathing heavily from the mental and emotional effort it took to keep those feelings contained before I just started bawling. I had to quickly stuff it again, however, because after a few minutes, I saw them return to the bunker and start loading more crates into it. But this time I'd calmed down a bit, having gotten some of the crying out. But at the same time, I knew I still had to be quiet, because the hearing trumpet worked both ways. They spent the next couple of hours moving their crates into the bunker, occasionally taking their dinghy back to a larger boat that I could barely see just offshore. I was too scared to leave the panic room, and felt too sick to eat, even though I'd calmed down to the dead inside recuperative phase by that time. When they seemed to be done, they made one more pass around the island to check and see if I was around. I was still in the panic room, so I hadn't even lit any lights in the other buildings. As the sun started rising, I climbed out of my pit, up to the top of the solar tower, and watched the lights of their boat as it sailed away into the distance. When it was gone, I went back to my room and just sat in a daze for a while, before trying to take a nap, exhausted from the emotional stress. I didn't sleep long, however, as every little sound woke me up with a jerk. I didn't really know what else to do after that but resume my routine, though in a late and listless way. I started my records and pots cooking first, remembering that keeping busy has been my primary strategy for dealing with my feelings here. When I checked the octopus pots, I started to think the octopi were getting wise to me, because I didn't catch any last night, and many of the pots were empty, though this might also have been because I got to them late today. While I was walking through the woods foraging, I spent some time thinking, and acknowledged to myself that it could have gone a lot worse. I was expecting them to try and burn everything to the ground. I tried to convince myself that this was evidence for humans not being complete jerks, just self-serving, and as long as I don't get in the way of that, we can coexist more or less peacefully. I didn't entirely believe myself, though. While I was out, I reluctantly collected the transmitter and assessed the damage, even though the area still felt somehow dangerous to me. The coil, circuit board, and battery were smashed, spilling acid everywhere, but I could still reclaim the metallic components. The resistors, capacitors, and transistors weathered the attack well enough due to their compact construction. I also took a peek at whatever it was that the smugglers were smuggling. I was scared, feeling like I was somehow pushing my luck, but at the same time, it wasn't like they expected me to be here and booby-trap the cases, nor did there appear to be any attempts at additional security measures, like security cameras. Again, it wasn't like they were expecting me to be here. The bunker door was locked, of course, so I got in through the ceiling vent like before. The cases, on the other hand, were not locked, and I had to look inside, so I could get an idea of what kind of people I was up against. Inside were clear bags of packed white powder, which I couldn't identify but presumed to be drugs of some kind. I've never taken drugs before, so I didn't know how to differentiate them. In my mentally and emotionally exhausted state, I briefly wondered if I should try some to see if it would bring me any relief, but I shook that thought away. My mental faculties are my greatest survival asset, and doing anything that might permanently dull them is and always has been for me an unacceptable risk. Besides, I didn't want to give them any reason to think that I may have an inclination to tamper with their stash, so I simply closed the lid and beat a hasty retreat back to my base, even though I knew there was no one around to chase me. By this time, I had lunch, and I slowly ruminated on my meal. I didn't feel like doing anything else, and my mind was so foggy that I just tried to take another nap, marginally more successful than the last. When I got up, the wreckers were done cooking, so I pulled them out of the kiln and poured hot resin on them to replace the prototypes that kept skipping. A quick test saw them working much better, even when running the gramophone at insane speeds just to check their resilience. This helped me get my mind off this morning a little, and restored focus on what I needed to do. With the smugglers now confirmed to be a viable threat, I decided that I probably needed to rebuild the transmitter if I wanted to have any hope of getting out of here, though this time I may have to build my own radio tower to prevent the transmitter from being destroyed. I mixed up some clay and started making a new battery case and breadboard tablet, but that was all I really had the energy to do today, so I left them to dry overnight. I spent the rest of the evening just sitting and watching the sunset, occasionally pulling out my telescope to scan the horizon. When the sun went down, I didn't really bother to light any of the lamps, just in case they drew unwanted attention. Just got ready for bed, but my sleep was fitful. Week 25, Day 7. I woke up still quite weary on the Sabbath, and checked the horizon to make sure the smugglers didn't come back, before trying to get on with my life. At least I managed to catch one octopus this morning. After doing the rest of my morning chores, I decided to start the day transcribing my Bible recordings, and the words gave me a little hope, especially when the sermon came on later and the pastor started preaching. The sermon topic was on Daniel and the lion's den, and while the delivery came across to me as a bit simplistic, at least compared to how Dad used to preach, I could at least appreciate that it was a story I needed to hear today, and it helped give me a little courage to move on. I tried to relax, spending some time finally writing and drawing down a description of the octopi I'd been collecting before it was time for lunch. I checked on my soda bottle while I was cooking, which I suspected by this time had probably overcarbonated, but found that it was, in fact, still flat. It still tasted pretty good, however, and helped lift my spirits a little. I did some more writing until it was time to take the transmitter parts out of the kiln. I let them cool and began to reassemble the circuit. The variable capacitor got smashed up the worst, so I had to carefully remove the plates, soften them with heat, and bend them back into shape before attaching them to the new dial framework. When I tested it out with the rewound inductor coil, however, I could tell that there were still some inconsistencies in the stations it would pick up. Some it would skip over completely, and others it would linger on as I continued rotating the dial. It should be good enough, though. Some of the capacitors were smashed up too, and needed a little repair with latex to get the plates inside back into alignment with each other. The thin lead plates in the battery at least weathered the attack with little damage, so the battery itself was easy to rebuild. I took a short hike up to the sulfuric acid lake at the top of the crater to refill the battery, and took my time there admiring the view, before heading back down and refilling the battery. I decided not to start charging it yet because although the dynamo is outputting more power now and could probably handle charging the battery and depositing the next iron plate, the acid in the battery was probably a little too dilute to function effectively, so I poured it into my fractional distiller to concentrate it. The residual heat from the kiln will probably be enough to reduce it gently overnight. As I got ready for bed, I noticed how this project briefly made me forget about the smugglers. Things have almost gone back to normal, like they weren't even here. I wonder if maybe things will be fine after all. Maybe if I keep to myself, they'll just ignore me. Blooper Reel. Take me down. Take me down. Hold on. Oh, that's too much. Go back up. Why do they hide the little arrow buttons? User interface has really gone down the toilet since they tried to make everything fancy for the smartphones. I'm such an old man. Now, where was I? Some of the earliest phonographs. No, that's too much. So I could apply a little. Oh, I'm so dry. Alright, just pause. This is getting irritating. I then had a quick lunch before having to deal with the next problem with my typewriter. There's a hair in my mouth. I still harvested the largest tubers. Excuse me. But they were also eliminated. I guess they weren't as eager to do that as I guess they weren't as eager to do that as my a little sea salt complimented. What are words? Sneeze. The aftermath. When I first arrived on the island, I got bad headaches from Kathy withdrawals. Who the heck is Kathy? Incidentally, I found that the fig trees also produce latex, so I'm in no short supply there. Did I discover that a previous week? Should I cut this out because it'd be redundant? I'll check on that later. Before setting it in the kiln, okay, we have a typo. Typo, please. Resume. Hey there. Thanks for listening to the end. I'm afraid the smugglers are probably not done with me yet, so I'm going to try and get the transmitter up and running again as soon as possible. If you want to see how that turns out, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified of who reaches me first. If you'd like to help me with that, the best thing you could possibly do would be to share this video with someone else who you think would enjoy it, as each time these videos get passed from one person to another, they get closer to finding someone who can get me out of here. Pressing the like button helps too, as any and all engagement tells the algorithm to do some of that sharing for you. Except maybe the dislike button. Please don't press that one. I've been through enough today. While we're waiting here, though, if you have any thoughts, stories, or perspectives on this week's episode, please feel free to share them in the comments section below. I could use the company. Whatever you choose, I appreciate you listening to me for this long. And if all goes well, I hope to see you here again next week.